Hi folks, welcome to our second update for the Ultimate Introduction to Arnold 6 for Cinema 4D course from Mograph Plus. In this update, we'll be covering all the new features that were introduced in C4D2A 4.0, which uses the Arnold Core 7.0. In this lesson, we take a look at some of the really useful improvements that they have added to the ACES workflow. It shouldn't be a very long video, so let's get into it. If you open up the render settings and come down to the color manager section, you notice the default color manager is now set to ACES. So now when you are using Arnold as your render engine, by default you work in ACES. Also, we no longer have to load the OCIO config file manually or through an environment variable, as Arnold now ships with a standard OCIO configuration file, so everything works out of the box. If you want to load your own OCIO config file like we used to previously, you just need to change the color manager from the default ACES to OCIO, and now you can set up everything manually like we used to. But for now, let's use the default ACES mode. Let's open up IPR and start a quick render. You notice we are rendering in ACES without having to do any manual labor. Obviously, we still have to set up our textures properly like we learned in the course. If I quickly create an image node, and open it up, you still need to choose a proper color space for your textures, but now it is much easier as the more frequently used ones like sRGB, linear sRGB, and raw are readily available from up here and you don't have to look for them. If we come back to the render settings, you notice there are two new options: view color space and bake view color space into output picture viewer. This view color space option is the same as the color space menu in the IPR that we learned in the course. So you can control the ODT from the IPR or right from the color manager settings. If you don't remember, we are rendering in ACES, but our screens have a limited dynamic range. So we need to see the final rendered result in a color space that can be properly viewed on our screens. That's when this view color space comes into play. But instead of a simple sRGB, now by default it is set to ACES 1.0 SDR video sRGB, which simply means standard sRGB image with an ACES SDR or standard dynamic range tone mapping applied to it. So we basically view the final render that we did it with ACES in sRGB with a beautiful filmic tone mapping applied to it. Obviously, you can change that. We can try maybe untone mapped sRGB. Or ACES 1.0 SDR Rec 709. Cool. For most people, ACES 1.0 SDR sRGB is the preferred view color space. We also have this new bake view color space into output picture viewer. This was not introduced in Arnold 7 specifically, but we get to talk about it right now. Let's take a final render while this option is turned off and see what we get. So here is our render. As we learned, Cinema 4D's picture viewer does not support a proper ACES workflow yet, and therefore we get this incorrect result. So what happens is that picture viewer expecting a render in the linear color space and then applies its sRGB gamma correction on top of that, and we get this wrong result. To solve this issue, we can enable this bake view color space. And now if we take another render to the picture viewer, now we get the same result as we saw in the IPR, but you need to be careful when using this option. Turn it on when you want to save your final render to an 8 or 16-bit integer image like JPEG or PNG, because in that case you probably don't plan on any post-processing and proper ACES conversion in post. So you turn this option on before starting the final render, and the final image will have the proper color space already baked into it, and you don't have to do the ACES conversion from ACES CG to sRGB or from ACES CG to ACES CC then sRGB in post. But turn this option off when you want to save your final render to a 32-bit float image format like EXR, because if you have this option on when trying to save your final render to a 32-bit float point image, you are essentially limiting yourself in post, as you will no longer be in ACES, as you have already baked the ACES to sRGB or Rec 709 or whatever conversion to your final render. So obviously for most professional renders, you want this option to be turned off. So for now, let's have it disabled. Finally, let's talk about some of the smaller ACES related updates. If we add an Arnold sky to our scene and change its color mode to texture and load an HDRI map, now we get this new color space menu where we can define a proper color space for the texture that is linked to our Arnold sky, which as we know should be linear sRGB for a 32-bit image, and by default it is set to do that. The same thing is true for a normal Arnold light. So if we add a quad light, for example, and change its color mode to texture and load a proper 32-bit HDRI map like this umbrella texture, we get to define its color space using this menu, which in most cases, as we are using 32-bit textures as our light source textures, the color space needs to be linear sRGB, which is the case by default. And finally, if you open up your preferences window and come down to the Arnold section, down here, you can have a default color manager. So you can set up a default color manager for all your new scenes right from here. It's pretty self-explanatory, so let me not waste your time. That's it really. That was all the ACES related updates in Arnold 7. See you in the next video.